The OECD, IMF, and World Bank are singing the same tune: inflation is on its way down. Sounds promising, right? Well, I just took a bite out of that optimistic outlook, literally. $3 for a slice of apple pie in Bali. This isn't New York or Paris, folks. I mean, come on, I could buy a whole meal for that price back home. So, what gives? Are these bigwig reports missing something? Is the cooling down just happening in fancy economic models, while real people like me are feeling the heat in our wallets? I was hoping the Asian Development Bank would shed some light on this Southeast Asian situation, but their report is still baking in the oven. Stay tuned for finding out what is inside the reports and maybe a few tips on where to find affordable pie in paradise. Always stay safe.
All right, so let's dive right in. Today we're tackling the global economic outlook for 2024 and 2025. We've got fresh reports from some big names, the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank. Now, I know you're all seasoned economists, so you know these institutions, but what we're doing today is digging into their predictions, comparing, contrasting, seeing what the nuances are and what they could mean.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how these institutions, even though they're using similar data, sometimes they come to different conclusions, right? And it's those little variations that I think can give us the most valuable insights.
Exactly. And the IMF and OECD just released their reports this month, December 2024. So this is hot off the press stuff. Let's start with the big picture. Global growth. Everyone seems to be predicting a stable but maybe not so exciting trajectory.
Yeah, stable but uninspiring. That seems to be the common thread. The IMF's forecasting global growth at 3.2% for both 2024 and 2025. And the OECD is a bit more optimistic. They're projecting 3.3% for 2024 and 2.9% in 2025.
So not really a booming return to pre-pandemic growth levels then. And the IMF's 5-year forecast is even less impressive, just at 3.1%. I mean, that kind of raises questions about long-term economic vitality, doesn't it?
It does. That long-term forecast from the IMF kind of suggests maybe we're settling into this, a new, normal, slower growth, which has huge implications for investment, for policy decisions, even for social stability.
Okay, so let's move on to inflation. I mean, there's a sense of cautious optimism here, wouldn't you say? It seems like the inflation dragon's losing a bit of its fire.
Yeah, the IMF report does point to a cooling trend.
Yeah.
They're projecting that global headline inflation will drop from 6.7% in 2023 to 5.8% in 2024, and then even further down to 4.3% in 2025. But they're also really emphasizing that we need to keep a close eye on core services inflation, which could be stickier and maybe harder to control with monetary policy.
All right, that's a really important point. Even if headline inflation goes down, those underlying pressures in the services sector, well, they could keep inflation higher for longer than we want. Could this difference in inflation trends between goods and services, could it create some policy dilemmas for central banks?
It's definitely possible. Central banks might have to walk a tightrope, try to keep inflation in check without hurting economic growth. And that challenge gets even trickier when you consider how inflation is playing out differently in advanced economies versus emerging markets.
Yeah, the IMF predicts advanced economies will see a bigger drop in inflation, down to a comfortable 2% by 2025. But for emerging markets, it'll be slower, more gradual. This difference could have some interesting effects on global capital flows and currency markets.
It could. It's a good reminder that the global economy isn't just one big blob, right? Different regions face unique challenges and probably need tailored policy responses.
Now let's focus on one region that's getting a lot of attention: China. Both the IMF and the OECD have expressed concern about China's slowing growth and the potential for deflationary pressures.
China's slowdown is definitely a big deal. It's going to have ripple effects globally. Both the IMF and OECD are saying this slowdown is partly due to problems in their housing market, which has been a big engine for growth in China for years.
It's interesting that they're highlighting internal factors within China, especially the housing market, as major contributors to the slowdown. It suggests that China's problems aren't just caused by external pressures like trade wars or geopolitical tensions, right?
Exactly. The IMF and OECD seem to be hinting that China's economic model, which has relied so heavily on investment and exports, well, it might be reaching its limits. They're calling for some serious structural reforms to rebalance the economy towards domestic consumption and innovation.
That makes sense. A more balanced and sustainable growth model would be good for China in the long run, and it would also have positive spillover effects on the global economy.
For sure. A healthy Chinese economy is absolutely essential for global growth and stability.
Now, let's talk about global trade. We all know that geopolitical fragmentation is a major concern, but how's it actually affecting trade patterns?
Well, the IMF projects global trade will grow at a pretty modest 3.25% in both 2024 and 2025, which are historically low figures. This slowdown is partly because of those geopolitical tensions and the rise of protectionist policies.
So trade's still happening, but it's not exactly booming. Is this a fundamental shift in global trade patterns or just a temporary blip?
Well, the IMF report highlights an interesting trend, the rise of what they call intra-bloc trade. So while overall global trade is slowing, trade within geopolitical blocs is actually increasing. It seems like countries are prioritizing trade with their allies, which could lead to a more fragmented and regionalized global trading system.
That makes you wonder about the future of multilateral trade agreements and institutions like the One Trade Organization. Could we be heading towards a world of competing trade blocs, each with their own rules and regulations?
It's definitely something to think about. It would have huge consequences for global supply chains, investment flows, and economic integration.
Okay, now let's dig into the policy recommendations from these institutions. It seems like everyone agrees we're in a very delicate economic situation that needs careful handling and a focus on long-term sustainability. Where do they line up in terms of their policy prescriptions?
Well, they all seem to agree on monetary policy. The shift towards easing has already started. But the IMF especially stresses the need for careful calibration to make sure we have a smooth landing. Bringing inflation down without causing a sharp economic downturn.
So it's like they're saying, tap the brakes but don't slam on them. But won't this gradual approach to monetary easing just prolong the problem of high inflation?
It's a valid concern. It shows the tough decisions central bankers have to make right now. They need to control inflation. But they also don't want to trigger a recession.
Right. And that balancing act gets even harder when you remember the different inflation trends we talked about. Advanced economies might be ready for easing, but emerging markets with their persistent inflation, they might need a different approach.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all monetary policy just won't work in this situation.
Okay, let's move on to fiscal policy. The IMF is sounding the alarm about high debt levels and calling for urgent fiscal consolidation, especially in emerging markets.
Yeah, the IMF's really worried about the debt burden in those economies, which has grown significantly in recent years. They say high debt levels make it harder for countries to handle economic shocks and could even lead to a debt crisis.
But isn't there a risk that aggressive fiscal consolidation could actually stifle growth, especially when we're already facing a slowdown?
That's a good point, and the IMF acknowledges that. They say the pace of fiscal consolidation should be tailored to each individual economy. It's about finding that balance between fiscal responsibility and supporting economic recovery.
So no blanket austerity measures,
Yes.
but a strategic and targeted approach to debt reduction. What specific policies are they recommending for this fiscal consolidation?
Well, they're suggesting a mix of spending cuts and revenue increases. They say government should prioritize spending, maybe reduce expenditures on less essential programs, and also explore ways to boost tax revenues.
Okay, so tighten the belt, but strategically. That's not a message everyone's going to love, especially those who rely on government programs and services. It makes you wonder about potential social and political backlash.
You're right. Fiscal consolidation always involves difficult choices and trade-offs, and the IMF knows that. They say these measures need to be implemented carefully, with consideration for their social impact.
Now, let's talk about structural reforms. Both the IMF and OECD emphasize their importance for long-term economic health and sustainability. But we know these reforms can be politically tough to implement.
They are. Structural reforms often mean overhauling regulations, labor markets, social safety nets. All things that can meet resistance from various interest groups. But the IMF and OECD say these reforms are absolutely crucial for boosting productivity, for accelerating the green transition, and ensuring long-term economic competitiveness.
So, short-term pain for long-term gain. Are they giving any specific advice on how to navigate the political challenges of these reforms?
They are. The IMF in particular stresses the importance of clear communication and public engagement. They say policymakers need to do a better job of explaining the rationale and benefits of these reforms to the public. And at the same time, they need to address concerns about potential negative impacts on vulnerable groups.
That's so important. If people feel like structural reforms are fair and equitable, they're more likely to succeed.
Exactly. It's about making sure the benefits of economic growth are shared widely and that nobody is left behind.
Okay, we've covered a lot in this section. China's slow down global trade patterns. And those policy recommendations from the IMF and OECD.
Before we move on to our final segment, where we'll compare and contrast all the key takeaways from these reports and explore some thought-provoking questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you the most so far?
Yeah, for me, it's that tension between short-term needs and long-term goals. How do we address immediate challenges like inflation while also laying the groundwork for sustainable growth?
Absolutely. It's a classic dilemma, right? But it's especially tricky in the current global landscape, with so much uncertainty and so many interconnected factors at play.
And speaking of different perspectives, let's bring in the World Bank now. They've also weighed in on the global economic outlook. And while they share some concerns with the IMF and OECD, they seem a bit more optimistic about emerging markets and developing economies.
Yeah, they seem to believe those economies have more resilience and potential for growth, even with the current headwinds. And they really stress the importance of investing in human capital, especially education and healthcare, as key drivers of long-term growth.
That's a really important point. It reminds us that economic growth should ultimately be about improving people's lives. But how does the World Bank's view on specific policy recommendations compare to the IMF and OECD?
Well, it's interesting. They agree on the need for prudent macroeconomic management and structural reforms, but their focus leans more towards sustainable development goals. They're all about inclusive growth, making sure there are social safety nets, and targeted support for vulnerable populations during economic transitions.
So it's a slightly different emphasis. While the IMF and OECD are mainly focused on macroeconomic stability and structural reforms to drive growth, the World Bank adds that layer of social equity and sustainability.
Exactly. They're reminding us that sustainable economic growth isn't just about sound fiscal and monetary policies. It's also about investing in people, in social infrastructure, and in protecting the environment. It's a more holistic approach.
And that's crucial, right? Especially when you think about the potential social and political backlash. That can happen when economic policies are seen as unfair or unequal.
You're absolutely right. Ignoring those social dimensions can undermine even the best intentioned economic reforms.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to summarize what we've learned from comparing these three different perspectives. What are the key takeaways for economists like yourselves?
Okay, so first, even though their forecasts vary a bit, all three institutions agree that the global economy is in for a period of moderate growth, but with a lot of uncertainty still hanging over our heads. Inflation's still a worry, but there's some cautious optimism that it'll start to cool down. The tricky part is figuring out how to manage that without causing a recession. It'll require some very careful policy calibration and coordination.
Right, especially with those different inflation trends in advanced and emerging economies.
Exactly. Second takeaway, China's slowdown is a big deal. It's going to have global consequences. The IMF and OECD are pushing for structural reforms in China to tackle those internal challenges and rebalance their economy towards domestic consumption and innovation.
And that rebalancing could have big implications for global trade patterns and supply chains, maybe even speed up that shift towards regionalization we talked about earlier.
It could. And finally, all three institutions are really stressing the importance of long-term sustainability. The IMF and OECD focus on fiscal responsibility and structural reforms to increase productivity and competitiveness. But the World Bank adds another crucial element. They want to see investments in human capital and social development to make sure that growth is inclusive and sustainable.
So it's not just about economic growth for the sake of growth. It's about making sure that growth leads to real improvements in people's lives and a healthier planet. That's a message that really resonates, especially now with all the economic and social inequality we're seeing.
I agree. These reports give us valuable insights and guidance, but the real test is putting those recommendations into action and creating effective policies that address the complex and interconnected challenges facing the global economy.
And that's where you all come in. Your expertise and insights as economists are more important than ever. We need rigorous analysis, informed debate, and innovative solutions to navigate these uncertain times. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final question to consider. In this environment of constant uncertainty and competing priorities, what economic indicators will you be watching most closely in the coming months? What are the key signals that will guide your policy recommendations and investment decisions? It's something to think about as you continue your work, shaping a more prosperous and sustainable future for everyone. It's a lot to think about, and I think it highlights the importance of our roles as economists. We need to be able to analyze these trends, understand the nuances, and provide sound advice to policymakers and businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a responsibility to use our knowledge and skills to help navigate these complex challenges and contribute to building a more stable and equitable global economy.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions.
keep pushing for solutions, and together, let's work towards a brighter economic future for everyone.